All right, as we discussed last week on All Hallows Eve in the year 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the Castle Church in Wittenberg, simultaneously, a French boy at the age of 8 years old was preparing for the priesthood, and he would later kind of take Luther's mantle and further the cause of the Reformation. And this man's name was John Calvin. Now, Luther and he actually never met. Calvin was about 25 years his younger, and they never had the opportunity to meet, but they appreciated each other's works. In fact, Luther said, "His books I have perused with singular pleasure." And Calvin referred to Luther as his most respected father. Okay, now, there were, very quickly, Luther and the Lutherans and the Reformers disagreed with certain secondary doctrines, and these disagreements have lasted to this day. In particular, the Lord's Supper, which we've briefly discussed and we don't have time to get into today. However, Luther did say toward the end of his life that after reading what Calvin had said regarding the Lord's Supper, he thought that this disagreement could have been mended had they actually had the opportunity to talk, which they never did. So that disagreement lasts to this day. Now, Philip Melanchthon, who was pretty much a Lutheran, he followed Luther around all over the place. He was kind of his colleague, kind of his assistant. And after Luther died, around that time anyway, he gave John Calvin his lasting title, essentially. We remember Augustine is the Doctor of Grace. We remember Thomas Aquinas was the angelic, and he still is, the angelic doctor, the doctor of the angels. And for anybody who knows philosophy, Aristotle is referred to as the philosopher. So in philosophical circles, when anybody refers to the philosopher, everybody knows they're speaking of Augustine. Well, Philip Melanchthon called Calvin the theologian. Calvin's theology, I find to be the greatest gift ever given over to the church. Luther, again, when I spoke of my 5 favorite theologians, Augustine was great and really paved the way for theological development. Thomas Aquinas, I just think was a brilliant man, and he gave much to the church in the realm of philosophy, apologetics, and theology. Luther did well in articulating certain portions, I like to call them vignettes, of theology. John Calvin was the great he was very systematized. He gave theology in a very systematic way, where when Luther would teach about certain areas of doctrine, he really wouldn't appreciate or consider the ramifications of other portions of theology and so forth. John Calvin was brilliant, and man, I'm already taking too long. However, I want to just say this real quickly. Another theologian at this time, Butzer, wrote a huge commentary on the epistle to the Romans. Okay, the reason it was so huge was at certain times he would kind of give these theological treatises along with the commentary, and John Calvin was not interested in that. But when he was issuing his institutes, and we'll get into this very briefly, he would refer, so in his large, extensive commentaries, he would refer to his institute. So for, a theological treatise on this, see my institutes. And sometimes in the institutes, he says for a biblical perspective of this, see my commentary. So he was very systematic. He knew what he was talking about in the certain areas to which these would kind of cross-reference, for lack of a better way of putting it. Now, he was born July 10th in 1509 to Gerard and Jeanne Calvin, his French in Noyon. Okay, I'm not good with French, so that's about as far as I'm going to go. Noyon. Okay, his French name was Jean Calvin. Okay, but the anglicized version is John Calvin. Now, Gerard was something of a financial administrator to the Roman Catholic Church's bishop in Noyon. So he was very prominent. He was something like a lawyer. Okay, he was very prominent, and so he sought chaplaincy for John Calvin at a very young age. And so around 8 years old, he began to prepare for the priesthood. At 14, John Calvin entered the University of Paris, and he learned. The University of Paris was probably, I mean, it's fair to say, it was the greatest university at that time. And he became very well versed in Latin and the scholastic and also classical literature. This was a time, you would learn very much about the Renaissance, humanism, so to speak, where Erasmus was very proficient with that as well. But he learned very much at this University of Paris. He graduated at the age of 17, and his father had something of a falling out with the bishop in Noyon, so he decided instead of that, he was going to send Calvin to the Church of Orleans. See, it's Orleans, but it's Orleans, okay, in 1528, and later Bourges in 1529. Now, in 1531, his father unexpectedly passed, and for a time, Calvin quit pursuing his law degree, and he eventually returned and did receive his law degree in 1532. At this time, somewhere around this time, nobody knows when exactly, but at this university, there were many Protestants. There were a few. Okay, again, this is when the Protestant Reformation is very young, and so there were some, and we don't know exactly how John Calvin was ultimately converted to Protestantism. John Calvin spoke very little about himself. When you read Luther, he kind of wore his life himself on his sleeve. John Calvin did not. He, outside of a brief portion, really in his preface on the commentary of the Psalms, on his commentary of the Psalms, which were very dear to him. Parenthetically, let me say, you will see throughout church history, every single one of the men I'm discussing here loved the Psalms. C.S. Lewis wrote much about the Psalms. Jonathan Edwards loved the Psalms. Luther read and studied the Psalms every single day, at least 3 times a day. John Calvin loved the Psalms. However, in a brief portion of his commentary, again, in the preface, he basically says that he was converted suddenly. In other words, kind of unexpectedly. He did not expect this to happen. This changed his life ultimately for the better, in my opinion. Before this, or again, it could be possibly around this time. Again, what he wanted to do with John Calvin, if you would have just put John Calvin in a closet or in any kind of isolated room to study and to write, you would have made John Calvin the happiest man in Europe, possibly in the world. But around this time, he, again, being a scholastic scholar and being very proficient with Latin and the classical works, he wrote a commentary, essentially, on the work of Seneca. Seneca was a philosopher back in, and he was an advisor to Nero. He tried to help Nero's moral character. So ultimately, he was an unsuccessful philosopher. However, it's a very brilliant treatise regarding Seneca's works. However, nobody really read it all that much. And again, it was around this time that he was converted, and it was possibly from a couple of Luther's works, the Babylonian Captivity of the Church and the Freedom of a Christian, that, again, he was converted. Now, he was kind of like Saul in that respect. He was kind of converted abruptly and suddenly, and he took up learning theology in a very systematic approach, in a different approach than it ultimately had ever been done. And I would just encourage any of you, to read his commentaries, but I think I'm going to kind of expect that y'all actually read his Institutes. I think for Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, or Reformed, I think John Calvin gives the greatest treatise of the Christian religion in the Institutes of the Christian religion. So November 1533, a lifelong friend of his, Nicholas Kopp, he was the rector of the University of Paris, and again, he was a friend of John Calvin. He was going to preach. He was preaching the opening sermon, ultimately, for the winter semester. And he gave a very reformed sermon. You have to understand, France was persecuting the Protestants at this time very harshly. England would too, and we'll get to that, God willing, after some time. However, so he gave this reformed sermon, and he was castigated. He was hated for his Luther-like sermon, for his Luther-like message. And it was found out that John Calvin actually helped him. We actually have that sermon in John Calvin's handwriting. So when that was found out, not only did he have to flee Paris, he ultimately had to flee France entirely. Now, he ended up going to Basel, Switzerland in 1534, which had become something of a Protestant stronghold. Okay, at that time. This is where he began writing his commentary on the Psalms. His first commentary was on the Epistle to the Romans. I mean, for any of us, that's a huge enterprise for a theologian. And his first one, at a very young age in Protestantism anyway, he wrote his commentary on Romans. But in Basel, he wrote his commentary on the Psalms, this is what he said, being of a disposition somewhat unpolished and bashful, which led me always to love the shade and retirement, I then began to seek some secluded corner where I might be withdrawn from the public view. So again, Calvin just wanted to study and write. That's all he wanted to do. So in Basel, Calvin wrote the first edition of what will later become the Institutes. Okay, so he would edit and revise and expand the Institutes 5 different times it was published. Okay, so the first edition was not like this huge. It was about 1/5 its size. It was about 85,000 words, whereas the Institutes are over 450,000 words. So his first, now he was 25 at this time. Spoiler alert, he ended up living only to the age of 54, and we'll get into that. But at the age of 25, he's already written this commentary to the Romans. He's writing the commentary on the Psalms, and he has already published his first edition of the Institutes, and this was very well respected in all areas. This was very well received. People loved it. And again, if you read the Institutes, you will see why. There's really nothing like it, just for the record. So again, now in 1536, he decided to move to Strasbourg. It's kind of in southern Germany, okay, where the great reformer Martin Bucer was. But he wanted to go there again for retirement and to study and to write and so forth. Now, war was breaking out between France and Germany. Pick your time period, and basically this is kind of happening all the time. So he couldn't take the direct route. He kind of had to go around, okay? Now, in order to go around and get there, he had to stop through Geneva. Calvin's very famous for his time in Geneva. Now, again, he was just going to spend the night there. That was his plan. He was just going to stay the night and continue on. However, the great reformer William Farel, okay, not Will Ferrell, it's William Farel, okay, was a great reformer there. He was very instrumental in bringing Geneva from the Roman Catholic Church into Protestantism. And ultimately they did. They left the Catholic Church and became a Protestant city, so to speak. You have to understand the separation of church and state was not a thing at this time. The church and the state were very much involved. Now, they would reform this involvement. In fact, Calvin was very instrumental in giving the magistrates, the city leaders, so to speak, the political and government power that does not belong to the church. The church is here to advise and to help you along, but the church is here for the discipline of the church. For the world, God sets up and appoints men and women for this cause. And so they gave the power back to where it belonged ultimately. However, so when John Calvin arrived in Geneva, everybody recognized him as the writer of the Institutes. Now, Farel was a great reformer, and he was very good at what he did, but he was not organized at all. And after, reading the Institutes, he realized, we need this fella. We need this guy to stick around. We need John Calvin to stick around. Again, John Calvin had no interest in that at all. He ultimately said no. And then Farel kind of warned him. He said, ultimately, God is going to curse you. Curse your studies, so to speak, if you do not remain where you are most needed. And Calvin says he heard that as really a call from God. So he remained there for a time. And if you read about his time there, he hated it. He hated it. There was a lot of corruption in the city. You had somewhat of an organized prostitution situation where it would be cornered off in a certain area of the city. The prostitutes were licensed, and they would have a governess, something of a sophisticated madam. But at Geneva, there were what were referred to as the patriots. These were kind of the oldest living people that have been in Geneva for the longest time, and the libertines. The libertines were basically the antinomians of that time. They refused church discipline, and they just lived openly in sin. Openly in sin. Now, what Calvin wanted to do, again, he wanted to restore church discipline in the church, specifically at communion. Okay, when a person is living in open sin, they are not to partake of the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper is for the true regenerate and sanctified people, so to speak. Okay, so if you're living in sin, ultimately rejecting Christ, then you are not to take of the bread and the wine. The Roman Catholic Church had this for a period of time and has changed, and sadly Protestant churches have as well. However, this was not received well in Geneva. Nobody liked this. It's fine if you want to discipline the poor, but if you're going to discipline the wealthy, you're going to have a huge problem with this. This all erupted in April 23rd, 1538 on Easter, when he refused to give. So he just didn't give communion at all at this point, because if you're going to have a problem, and if I have to, give the Lord's Supper to even these antinomians, even the libertines, then I'm just not going to give it at all. And ultimately, he and Farel, for a time, Farel was exiled as well for a time. Calvin was exiled. Now, we've talked about exiles. We talked about men being exiled. I think John Calvin was the only one who was happy about getting exiled. He was very pleased with this. Anyway, he ended up going to Strasbourg, where he originally wanted to go anyway, and he ended up spending about 3 years there, and he loved it. He was ultimately preaching, again, though, he didn't want to preach at all, but Butzer kind of convinced him, much like Farel did, into taking to the pulpit to begin his public ministry in Strasbourg, ultimately to about 500 refugees. Again, people were fleeing from France to these different areas for safety, ultimately. And so he was preaching to about 500 people, and he loved it. He wrote very much during this time as well. Now, around, no, I don't have the specific date, but around 1541, I know this from memory, Geneva had received a letter from Cardinal Saudoleto, okay? And ultimately, he was trying to compel Geneva to return to the Roman Catholic Church. Ultimately, Calvin and Farel have separated from the church and so forth. Now, Geneva knew, they needed somebody who was able to reply to Saudoleto, okay? They couldn't do it. Farel wouldn't have done it as well. They knew the only one who could give an adequate response to this was John Calvin, whom they had just exiled. So they kind of had to come hat in hand and ask John Calvin to reply, which he did. We don't have time to get into his reply. However, I would very much implore you to read it. It's about 41 pages. It's not all that long, but it's probably one of the greatest defenses, the shortest, of the Reformation. Ultimately, he was saying, no, we did not separate from the church. You separated from the Holy Catholic, true Catholic Mother Church. It is you who have taken away from the Scripture, away from Christ, and taken the people away from the Word of God. And ultimately, with all your superstitions and so forth, he was better than Luther. Luther was kind of fiery. He was kind of like a volcano. Calvin, he began with very, very gently, but he did say, I am going to have to say some things fairly directly, and you're not going to like, but he was much more gentle than Luther was. Now, this also gave John Calvin an occasion to speak of his time in Geneva and some things that he wasn't able to do there because of the hostility he would receive in Geneva. Now, so he sent that reply and so forth, and that was great. Farel continued to try to get him to come back to Geneva. On March 29, 1540, Calvin wrote him back, rather would I submit to death 100 times than to that cross on which one had to perish daily 1,000 times over. He refused to go back to Geneva, and it wasn't Farel, and it wasn't Butzer, it wasn't any man who convinced him through warnings. It was Christ himself when he said, he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. And he recognized that he's living in peace, he's loving his time, and ultimately going back to Geneva would be the cross that he believed he was to carry, that he was to take up and walk with Christ in Geneva. So he ended up returning to Geneva. Now, he was an expositional preacher so much, essentially he would take 3 verses and preach on that. But he would go in order. Okay, so when he left Geneva, he was preaching on a certain portion. When he returned to Geneva, he just went to the next few verses. He just took right back up to from when he left. And he ultimately gave them an ultimatum. You wanted me back here, okay? And unless you let me issue the reforms and so forth, send me away again. Okay, that's fine. I'm fine with that. I was very happy. I was at peace, and ultimately, this is kind of what I'm wanting. But for the first about 15 years of his return to Geneva, it was a terrible time. It was a terrible time for him. Much hostility. People were naming their dogs after him, and so forth. Now, while he was still in Strasbourg, he married a widow by the name of Edette. She had 2 daughters who brought him much joy, and they would ultimately have a premature boy who didn't survive. And John Calvin would get castigated for that. Ultimately, this is God's judgment on you and so forth. And this broke Calvin's heart, of course. Now, they were married, and 9 years later, she died from the plague. And that broke his heart. But one of the, Calvin, I spoke of how Luther has been judged in our contemporary day through our psychoanalysis of today and so forth, and how he's portrayed and so forth. But I did say that was at least somewhat legitimate. Calvin's is not. If you actually read John Calvin, if anybody were to actually take up and read John Calvin and not just see these certain time periods that suggests otherwise, then they would see that he was, first of all, of a very sound mind and a very sound heart. So, in 1559, his fifth and final issue of the Institutes were released. Now, at that same year, he established the Genevan Academy, the Academy of Geneva. Okay, now, many of those who attended and graduated from this academy would be missionaries sent to France. And many of the students would joke that their degrees were their death certificates. Many of them did and were martyred for the cause of Christ. In 1560, 100 underground churches were planted in France. By 1562, because of these missionaries, because of these martyrs, there were over 2,000 churches in the open. The Reformation was really progressing at this time. Now, England also England was also beginning to persecute the Protestants very harshly, in particular, Bloody Mary. That's where Bloody Mary comes in. So many had to flee, and they found refuge in Geneva. In 1560, the first English Bible was issued, the Geneva Bible. And it was also the first Bible that had, theological commentary in the margins. This was the first English Bible. Early in 1564, Calvin became severely ill. He would have to be carried to the pulpit and kind of held up at the pulpit in order to preach. Around April, he gave his last address. He gave his farewell address to his contemporaries, the other ministers, so to speak. And he said, he was cautioning them, "You will have troubles when God shall have called me away. For though I am nothing, yet I know that I have prevented 3,000 tumults that would have broken out in Geneva. But take courage and fortify yourselves, for God will make use of this church and will maintain it, and assures you that he will protect it." So this is his farewell address to his ministers. Take heed, keep watch, but also keep faith. God will protect it and he will maintain it as he promises. He died about a month later. This address was on April 28th. He died on May 27th, ultimately in the presence of his successor, Theodore Beza. Beza had kind of gone away from his bedchamber, and he was called to hurry to return as John Calvin was dying. He didn't quite make it. However, the last words of John Calvin were, "How long, O Lord?" Taken from the Psalms. He was devoted to the cause of Jesus Christ to the end. Very faithful. And in fact, Beza said, it looked like he just fell asleep. He looked very peaceful. It looked like he was absolutely at peace. He died in peace. He suffered this illness for months. He was ultimately forced to remain in bed for a period of 2 months. That would be awful for the last couple months of his life. He's bedridden, but he died in peace. So again, he lived to be, and as he requested, he was buried in an unadorned coffin and in an unmarked grave, so there would be no cult of Calvin. This is what he wished, so we still don't know where his graveside is. But Geneva is a great place, and ultimately it's largely because of the work of John Calvin. Like I said, he died at the age of 54, and like we had mentioned with Thomas Aquinas, who lived to 49, it is incredible how in such a short period of time these men changed the world, reformed and helped the church. Even Thomas Aquinas, with many of his works, very much helped the church, the medieval church in particular. So, by way of conclusion, I do want to address one of the controversies regarding John Calvin. There was a man at his time in Geneva The man wasn't in Geneva. His name was Michael Servetus. He was anti-Trinitarian, okay? He was teaching against the Trinity, okay? Absolute heretic in all accounts, So he had to flee all over the place. You know, the Roman Catholic Church would have arrested him and executed him. Protestant churches would as well. Let me just say this briefly, because we can't understand this in our contemporary time. The people would be executed at this time because the people at the time saw heresy as kind of like a sickness. You know, think back during the time of the pandemic when everybody had to be quarantined, everybody had to isolate and so forth, and all the rest. They saw it very much like that. So ultimately, they were killing the germ, so to speak. They were killing the sickness, the illness from spreading. So this man was going around, and ultimately, he wanted to meet with John Calvin. You know, their friends and so forth were trying to arrange this. This never happened, but he would have correspondence with this man named Michael Servetus. And Calvin realized this man is not going to be persuaded. John Calvin was great at persuading. He wasn't perfect. You know, many of the reforms that he wanted to do in Geneva never took place. And one of them had to do with this. But he told Michael Servetus, do not come to Geneva. You are going to be arrested and you are going to be tried. And if you remain in your heresy, you are going to be executed. It will be very fatal for you to come to Geneva. However, with all the issues that Calvin had in Geneva, Servetus thought this was a great opportunity to come and preach his anti-Trinitarian doctrine and so forth. So he went to Geneva and Calvin had him arrested. Now, he's accused of being judge and executioner. That is not at all how this went down. The city fathers, the city leaders, so to speak, were the judge. He was essentially the prosecutor. Now, when judgment was handed down that he was a heretic and he was to be executed, as typically would be the case, burned at the stake, Calvin asked, look, this isn't to legitimize the fact that he was okay with this execution and so forth, but it's just to give a little bit of context behind this. He asked that he be hanged instead. And, you know, I know maybe that's not the biggest consolation. However, I would say if you have an opportunity to either get burned at the stake or hanged, choose the hanging. Okay? It's a much faster and, you know, somewhat more merciful way to die. But that's a brief account of some of at least the biggest point of controversy regarding John Calvin. John Calvin had a wonderful mind and he had a wonderful heart. He did not want to be in the public, but once he accepted it and once he stood behind his pulpit, he loved his people. He wanted to instruct and help lead his people. That's why he was so interested in this church discipline. It's not a vacuous situation. Again, even with the heresies, this was to eradicate the illness, the sickness of heresy. Okay, so he was interested in reforming the church back to the New Testament standards ultimately. And this is what he dedicated his life to. In his theology, in his teachings, you typically, like Augustine, he's known for his theology about God's grace. Thomas Aquinas, essentially the angels and so forth. Luther, really justification by faith. But again, he would just kind of speak, about certain portions of theology. Calvin, it's hard to really pin down because his theology was just biblical. He didn't really, but if there's one area that that might stand out among the rest is God's sovereignty. God's sovereignty. And he knew it was God's will that the Reformation took place to take the church back to the New Testament church, to where she should have been the entire time. And this is why we must continue to reform. This Reformation, it's a mischaracterization of the Reformation just to think of this as a 16th century situation going into the 17th century and so forth. That's why the motto is Semper Reformanda, always reforming, always reforming. Now, quickly, I do want to take some time next week to give you a very brief synopsis of his theology, of what he gave to the church. Because as I mentioned last week, the Reformation was kind of a dark time. I mean, it was a dark time anyway in this time, but it wasn't pretty. It wasn't like, everything just changed immediately and everything was hunky-dory. However, one of the mottos also that Calvin gave regarding the Reformation was post tenebras lux, after the darkness, light. And so what I want to show is the light that came out of the Reformation. And it shouldn't be surprising that when the church is faithful to her Christ, she is persecuted. She is persecuted. That is what the New Testament went through. That is, anytime God's people are actually faithful, the world despises us. The world despises us. We are not of the world, and so the world hates us. So it shouldn't be surprising that once a time of faithfulness returned, there was consternation, there was conflict, and so forth. So we will take some time to consider the light that came out of the Reformation, God willing, next week. All right, praise God.